Hello, everyone. Welcome to Frank Analysis. I am Franco, and today I'm going to review this book right here called Good Intentions: How Big Business and the Medical Establishment Are Corrupting the Fight Against AIDS by Bruce Nussbaum. And this was written sometime in the early 90s, and it pretty much is a record piece. It gives you information on what was happening during the fight against AIDS, the protests that were happening, what was happening at the NIH, the National Institute of Health, what doctors were doing at hospitals, how there was a discommunication between principal investigators at the NIH and these doctors that were on the ground, how these principal investigators at the NIH were also not communicating with doctors who were producing good results at these hospitals, at hospitals in Mexico, at hospitals in France, all because they were more interested and focused on their own careers and self-gain. And that should sound very familiar to a lot of you guys especially if you've been keeping up with a lot of the news that exposes or exposed the Rona narrative, during the 2020 and 2021, 2022, and even now in 2023, there's still new stuff that's coming out that exposes the Rona narrative. Not only does it talk about Anthony Fauci and the things that he was doing during this time, how he was getting called out by a lot of these protesters. They were part of a group called ACT UP. There's also other protesting groups also that were calling him out. Doctors from hospitals that really cared about having a treatment that was actually effective on the AIDS patients were calling him out. There's also Robert Gallo that's talked about in this book. We have David Barry, Mathilde Krim, and Larry Kramer. The book focuses also on a lot of other people too, like doctors. I might be pronouncing it wrong, Sonnenbaum, but what it's pretty much summarizing, and I'm gonna read a part here from this book that should really get you thinking. This is from page 330. It is a polite fiction that the NIH does public health. It will receive about $9 billion from Congress in 1990 to do a medical research that is supposed to benefit the public. 3/4 of it will be sent to principal investigators in their elite academic institutions around the country. In true trickle-down fashion, a portion of that money will actually go to meet the medical needs of people. But by and large, PIs, principal investigators, do their own kind of science, and more often than not, their experiments have little to do with either health or the public. They test drugs by private pharmaceutical companies for personal gain, for money that goes to their universities, and for power. There's a part of the book where there's a protester that was an activist that was yelling at Dr. Fauci, and telling him that the drug that he kept pushing for, AZT, was not effective. It was actually some of the components with AZT were toxic to the AIDS patients and was killing them. It was not very effective. But Fauci was saying, oh, there's no other drugs out there. And the activist was saying, what are you talking about? There's these hospitals here that are trying these other treatments like DDI or AL721 or peptide T that are helping the patients. And then Fauci was like, there's no results. Because it didn't go through the whole process of being published and peer-reviewed and put on this fancy journal, scientific journal, because it wasn't published there, the medical institutions would not acknowledge those treatments. Another part from the same page says, scientists do what they do totally without oversight because Congress and the public have accepted their argument that only they are knowledgeable enough to police themselves. The United States has never accepted this kind of argument from its military. It should not accept it from its biomedical establishment. And we've been seeing this during 2020, 2021, 2022, where a lot of people just accept whatever these higher ups at these biomedical institutions say, or these public health officials have to say, without really looking at the evidence that they're basing their arguments on. Sometimes they don't even base their arguments on evidence, and people just take what they say just because of their position. And that right there is a logical fallacy. It's an appeal to authority fallacy. You're not looking at the actual evidence. You're just taking their word for it because of who they are. Another part here, in page 331. There are dozens and dozens and dozens of drugs that may be far better than AZT against AIDS that are not being tested because of the structure of the nation's biomedical system. There are probably hundreds of drugs for opportunistic diseases that are similarly being ignored because PIs, principal investigators, have their own scientific agenda, which is not necessarily the same as the country's. So looking not just at AIDS, right? Because the author here, Bruce Nussbaum, then started questioning if they're doing this with AIDS, they probably did this with a whole bunch of other drugs too. That there's probably other treatments out there, natural treatments that are effective against certain diseases that don't get pushed out, don't get talked about in the media of how effective it is. Getting it to the ears of the people that need to hear it because they probably have the disease. And so they just take some mediocre drug that's accepted and pushed by these corporations, by big pharma. And then here's another part. Yeah, how many other drugs were passed in that fashion? Like how AZT was passed, even though AZT was a bit toxic on people. I wouldn't even say a bit, based on some evidence that I've seen, but I urge you all to do your own research on that. But the author says, how many other drugs were passed in that fashion? How many, such as AL721 or peptide T, were denied a fair chance because their company sponsors didn't have the right connections? At the end of the day, that's what it comes down to. If you want to get your drug passed, through the FDA, it's about who you know. Lastly, people with the disease, so people who had AIDS, their doctors. I would add some doctors because there's a lot of lazy and indoctrinated doctors out there that also just go by whatever the biomedical institution tells them to go by. And their advocates know more about treatment than do ivory tower PIs, principal investigators, hidden away from the realities of life and driven by careers that don't reward them for furthering the public health. And that's one thing we got to remember, is that Fauci and a lot of these other researchers, principal investigators, they are sitting in their ivory towers at the NIH or whatever institution it is that they work at with their lab coats, out of touch with what's happening on the ground, right? They're just doing lab work, and most of the time these PIs aren't even doing the lab work themselves. It's the people that are in their lab that are doing the work for them. And just, this isn't really discussed in this book, but there's like a lot of these workers, a lot of these people that are in labs are overworked, and they get very little pay. So yeah, like it just gets you thinking, not just AIDS, but with all these other diseases too. The drugs that are known for those diseases are just the ones that had people pushing for them that had the right connections with people at the FDA, or at these other scientific people who work at these scientific journals that do the peer reviews, and all that. There is one more thing I wanted to say about this, but I can't really remember it right now at the top of my head. But there's some cool images here that show us like protests that were happening at the time. A lot of that money that's being sent to these institutions like the NIH, like where does that most of that money go, is a question that this book was also asking, where these people have these like meetings after meetings after meetings, or just like reviewing things that's coming out of the scientific literature, and nothing ever goes anywhere. They're not talking to people on the ground. They're not talking to people at hospitals. And as it was mentioned, people who have the disease often know more about what's happening with them than the PIs do. But yeah, I highly recommend this book, Good Intentions. All right, it'll help you understand more about what was happening during that time, the suffering that these people, a lot of people in the gay community, were going through during that time. How so many people died unnecessarily. And I think it's very complementary with the movie, The Dallas Buyers Club. If you haven't heard of that movie, Matthew McConaughey won Best Actor in his role for that movie in 2013. And a lot of the stuff that's seen in that movie, it's like crosses over with stuff that's in this book right here. But yeah, guys, I highly recommend it. If some of you guys read the book and reach out to me and want to do a panel and discuss it, you're more than welcome to reach out. I'd be glad to do that. But yeah, take care, guys. Stay informed.